So we said earlier, right, that that the inside strategy has been tried, right? And there's a history of the independent left strategy too, right? Independent left parties carried progressive causes from the 1830s to the 1930s. Huge list: Working Man's Party, Liberty Party, Free Soil Party, Republicans. Talked about cooperative labor, abolition of land reform, radical reconstruction, right? With the Civil War, industrialization, and the kind of the battle for who was the biggest business party. That's what I think. My problem with the argument, the surface level shouting of the parties flipped, right? They didn't really flip. They just engaged in a battle over who was more pro-business. And we're still seeing that today, right? That is the key battle.
Or they support different industries that play off each other. But
yeah,
but it's it's capital against capital. It's not really
yeah. So there's this long history of independent left parties, labor unions, and the Communist Party's Popular Front. Supported the New Deal coalition, and that really did a lot of damage to the left independent movements, right? That was a big bellwether moment of the left collapsing into the Democratic Party. One thing that's not talked as often about that in that time period is how the world wars were used to rein in radical labor movements. They were a necessary part of the war machine. So, it was a big time when we saw, traditionally socialist, leftist bodies all of a sudden becoming patriotic and, towing government lines. And I think it is important, despite all this history, the United States is one of the only modern industrial countries not to consolidate a major working class party independent from capital, right? We're going to talk about the one we used to have in the next slide, and they still do exist, but they are not a mass party. There's no real mass left independent party in the United States.
Before we get to that, though, I want to reiterate the point here that there's a long tradition through most of U.S. history here, actually, of independent politics. This idea of the two-party system that kind of reigns supreme and there's no other choice is actually a relatively new phenomena in U.S. history. It wasn't that weird to vote for other parties, especially when you were talking, local state offices. Like there were plenty of regional parties, if not national parties. And we've lost a lot of that in modern history, in part because of things like the first and the second Red Scare that were used to, crush opponents of capitalism during the World Wars, like Chris was saying, as well as the New Deal coalition that was the carrot to the stick, right, of trying to bring in unions and whatnot into the Democratic Party, where they served capital instead of creating that independent base that the working class needs to create systemic change.
And another important thing to remember about it, too, is they were successful. Right? And that does continue to today. Greens are generally successful when we are able to run, real grassroots campaigns. In the last year, I remember we ran a lot of local offices in Illinois. We won 67% of our races, right? And Greens are close to 50% of victories all throughout history of all of our candidates. So, it wasn't just that these parties existed, but they won, and especially talking about labor socialism, right? The reason we have the 8-hour workday, child labor laws, like all of these things, is in part because we were not only, saw active labor movements, but we were electing socialists, right, to city councils as mayors, into state houses, into governorships, right? We were electing socialists, active, independent socialists, and so as it was said, this strictly two parties is really a post New Deal era, phenomenon. Obviously, there were our system breeds, kind of a top two parties. But there was much more lively, both ideological and regional.
And I forget if it's later in the presentation or not, but just to kind of go on that point, there's other countries in the world today that have voting systems similar to ours that still have the same plurality votes, first past the post, a lot of the same problems that we see today, but they still have, more than two parties participating in their national governments. The U.S. really stands out as only having this Republican Democrat dynamic.
And even when you get into independence, right? Like Bernie, when Bernie was first elected to the House in the 90s, one of the first things that happened was he came to an agreement with the Democratic Party, right? That agreement was he would caucus with them, which means he'll largely vote with them, right? He'll support their leadership, and in exchange, he would get committee assignments. And so even probably the most well-known independent of the modern era, his independence wasn't really independent from capital or the Democratic Party, right? It was very much an independence in name only. It tended to manifest itself in a loud bark with no bite, and we saw it kind of taken to its, what I would say, logical conclusion in terms of Bernie's rise, right? When Joe Biden was elected in 2020 and the Democrats had control of the House and the Senate, Bernie got that big committee chair spot, right? Bernie got put in that position where he could supposedly guide progressive policies, through the Senate and through Congress. And what we saw was not that, right? What we saw was Build Back Badly and an abandonment of the social capital bill. And so even getting to that, even making those deals for, go 30 plus years and getting to that point where you were given the position of power, what we learned was that position of power actually isn't a position of power. It's a figurehead position that can easily be undermined when you stack the rest of the votes against the chair.